All
Right.
right. So salute everybody. Layman
Salute.
Pascal is here at the Parallax View.
Layman's the coolest guy in the whole world, in my books.
The coolest guy. Why is that?
I
Yeah, by a long shot. He wins the
is
cool
it the
award.
shirt?
It's
Yeah,
it's
because
it's the whole package. It's everything. It's everything about you. Some people are peacocks and some people are hedgehogs. I'm a hedgehog. You're a peacock.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I'm gonna trust and read your book.
so why are you that cool, Layman?
How did you get that cool? That's what we want to
What's the
know about
secret?
you.
What
Well,
don't you know?
part of it's genetic. I mean, I think my parents are pretty cool. Um, Part of it's they just gave me a lot of free space, so I was able to find and do whatever I wanted to do. But at the same time, I was like driven. It was kind of compulsive for me in school and childhood to sort of find something that made me feel turned on apart from what everybody else was doing. And sometimes that was behavioral, sometimes that was stylistic. But if it's not exciting, if it doesn't give me joy to see myself on the screen, then why am I doing this?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. It's like a positive narcissism, like a
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so. And there's something about that, like we do have to be on guard for narcissism, and it's very sneaky. At the same time,
Yeah.
we want to find the idiosyncrasy of our soul, find like the subtle flavor that is you, and be able to live that somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember Chuck and Trump was saying that like we need to make love. He said, like, under heaven and earth, we have the right to make love to ourselves. We need to love us, just like, you know. Um,
And there's an ethics to it in terms of how you signal other people. Like it doesn't really matter how other people show up, but you want them to feel like they have the option of being as free and open as they would like to be. So sometimes
yeah.
the way I show up is like a suggestion to other people to know that at least that much is okay. It's fine. You want to go that crazy, you can go that crazy. That amount is fine.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. So how do you integrate that? Because I mean, I was just reading in terms of the great work, right? And so the great work in Western Hermeticism is about uniting polarities and dualities, ego and world, and ego and God and not God, and female and male aspect. And so how does it relate, and how does it condense in the nitty gritty of paying the bills and doing a stupid podcast like this one, so to unifying that and to find, you know, yeah, a sort of unification in acting.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's a bit like the brain hemispheres, which I mean, there's a lot of complexity to how you unpack the relationship between male, female, and left, right. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but the thing I think it has in common is there's this lateral duality, and between them there's this axis or directional line going in the other direction, right? So what you need to do is like thread that line forward. And it's always going to feel a bit unstable. You're always going to be moving between control and surrender, between discipline and release, between self engagement and, powering through for various things. But as long as they're going like this and you get that spot kind of moves in this direction on its own, is my experience. And you're never going to get perfect security around that. So it's about getting more and more comfortable in that in between space, I think. There's lots of different ways to think about how the dualities come into play. Like, so for some people, dualities are just so obvious, and for other people, dualities are so suspicious, whether it's because they're interested in diversity or they're interested in non duality. But really, the negotiated in between spot between all of that, I think that's where your pathway unfolds.
So you're doing like motion movements, like as if you were dancing. So do you see life as a dance in some form of capacity?
Yeah, in some form, right? Because there are multiple interpretive lenses we can apply. We can look at it where difference doesn't matter, and we can look at it where there's so many moving parts that you wouldn't even know who was in the dance. But it's very useful for brains like ours to think about it in terms of a two-party dance, a complementarity. Seems like we see that inside our nervous system. Seems like all of our ancestors use that metaphor to make sense of the world. Seems like life on this planet invented a complementarity system to do that. And then the dance part is that that's potentially enjoyable. There's a dynamism and a beauty that's particular to figuring out how those forces work together really well.
Right.
And that working together is not the same as just being masculine or being feminine. That's only one version of it, because you're negotiating back and forth within yourself, and the negotiation creates the higher level of resonance. Like John Vervaeke's always talking about opponent processing now. So there's all these different splits in ourselves. You be mind, body, conscious, unconscious, left, right, narrowing and expanding. You've got to move back and forth between them in order to negotiate that right spot. You're never going to find a perfect one spot where you can sit. So the only way is to steer back by moving back and forth between the two, which is essentially a dance move.
Yeah, and it's like sex. I mean, it's like you're two and you're not two and you're not one, right? It's like like I always think like the yin yang is too static of a symbol, even though there is the moving line, but the more expressive symbol is kind of an ultimate expressivity, rather than a harmony or something like that. Like,
Yeah, the harmony is a bit of a tricky metaphor, because you are, in a just a simple pragmatic fashion, you're looking for some kind of resonance that's working in the moment, and we could call that harmony. But we don't want to get carried away with that metaphor and think that there's a perfect balance or that there's perfect symmetry between these halves, right? They're functionally distinct, and they kind of throw each other out of balance, and it's only because they throw each other out of balance that they can be constantly collaboratively rebalancing. So there's a constant failure of balance just as much as there's a constant succeeding at balance.
well, I was thinking when you were talking about this, complementarity and gender and all that, and how people are so offended when you even try to tell them they're a man or a woman. It's like, I'm not that. You can't put me in a box. You can't define me as anything at all. I'm a unique being, and there's something true to that. But on the other hand, the limitation. I was talking to John Greer, who's this great occultist, on the podcast last night, and he was saying a limitation is freedom. Like, so if you can embody that limitation perfectly, then you're much more free than if you're trying to be every kind of multiplicity. And he said, if you try to do one thing, like just if you want to get something, if you want to achieve something, you just do one thing single-mindedly until you achieve it, and blot out all the rest. So and so that's that is sort of a phallic male, kind of like just going for, doing it. And then, like, so the masculine is just doing it, and then the feminine is this expressive energy that is dynamic and flying around, and the guy's driving the motorcycle to get to a destination, and the woman is just flying around. So I think, like, that, I don't mind those stereotypes. I think they're right. I think they're true. They're not everything, but why are people so horrifically offended, by their own limitations these days? It's
Well, I
kind of
think
an
there's
interesting
two
question.
things to that. One is that it's not everybody, right? It's a lot of people who occupy prominent media spaces who are aware of the potential limiting power of traditional metaphors. But there's a lot of people on this planet who just simply accept and live by those traditional metaphors as well, and we often don't hear them in the conversation as much.
Yeah.
But I think one of the issues here is that it has to be voluntary, right? We know from things like exposure therapy. I mean, the classic thing is, if you're afraid of spiders and I just throw a spider on you, that's not going to help. It's going to re-traumatize you. But if you're afraid of spiders and I tell you, look, if you agree to go and touch this spider, it's going to be good for you. You're going to be empowered by taking on that form voluntarily. Then a whole new process can unfold. So if somebody else is trying to tell you, if a system or a tradition or a group or another person is trying to say, this is what you are, and that's all you are, well, fuck them. right?
That's
But
true.
if
Yeah.
I get to volunteer to occupy a limitation if I get to be the male or get to be the female or get to be a particular entity in a universe, then it's tremendously empowering, right? It's sort of liberating and simultaneous with non-duality insofar as you're able to intentionally inhabit it. But if somebody else is trying to push that on you, then there's every reason to push back.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Well,
I mean, there's
and
like,
also there's a great way you can reverse that, and that is wonderful to reverse the sexuality for the man to try to inhabit the feminine and for the feminine to try to inhabit the masculine. So there is a spectrum. I'm not saying there's not a spectrum, but I don't like the idea that masculine and femininity are made problematic. That seems to be destructive to me. You know.
well, I mean, postmodernity has such a bad rep at the moment, and for some reasons, but there's also a point to postmodernism and the idea of the social constructiveness of identities and roles and concepts, because it's an evolutionary surplus in a kind of way. And
Sure.
and postmodernism is nothing else than us measuring ourselves, with the ruler of the philosophers of the 70s, basically, and I think that's the positive aspect, to know that these are arbitrary kind of notions. There are, you can't really contend with that.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that's where we want to go with something, if we indulge ourselves in a term like metamodernism and its notion of sincere irony, is that we want to be able to make full use of all of our inheritance, which includes masculine and feminine, yin yang in all its forms. But we also don't want to be enclosed or trapped in that, because there are lots of reasons and biases and circumstantial factors that produce that sort of thinking. So we want to be able to walk this edge of being able to fully use it and never be fully defined by it. And metamodernity has got to be able to really understand and move with all of the postmodern insights, and yet not inhabit that in a way that cancels out any of the other traditional or inherited modes of being.
Okay, so let me ask you something, Layman, because I was actually just thinking about this. So there are obviously different ideas about metamodernism, right? And so there's like the idea that it's a state of our culture as it is right now, with the weirdness, from described from Timothy Vermoyen and stuff. And then you have like the other notion that it's a pendulum oscillation movement between modernism and postmodernism, and a kind of harmonization. And then there's this third kind of where we think, no, it's something else completely, right? There is a novelty that is not deductible by, the previous stage, like emergence. When something emerges, you can't really explain it by something that came before, right? That's the basic idea. So there's an idea that there's an element which is as new as modernity was to traditional age, right? And so where do you yourself locate on this scale, and how do you harmonize these different notions of metamodernism?
So I think of metamodernism or metamodernity as in several different ways. One is, I think of it as trying to actually complete what postmodernism started but doesn't know how to do. Like, the postmodernism has a promise of introducing plurality and naturalness and external considerations that have been excluded from modernity back into the system, and transform the system by folding those marginalized things back into it. But it hasn't been able to do that. It's been sort of trapped in an intellectual and sociological mode. It hasn't allowed the multidimensionality of itself to come forward. So I think a full, healthy, multidimensional postmodernity that gets coherence in itself, that starts to become a new style. And that style looks similar to what the integralists were proposing. There's some additional thing. But I think one of the elements of metamodernism that's distinct from that is there's no particular mentality, there's no particular model of the world that goes with that. It's more of a mood, it's more of a style of cognition, and it's much more of a response to the novel conditions of this historical moment, which are, I think, twofold. One is what we're calling the meta crisis. And the other one is, what does reality look like now? So one of the reasons I call this course Sacred Technology and the Sacred Feminine is that our notion of reality has changed depending on the technologies we use to interrogate reality. And the technologies we're using now are giving us a very different picture than they were giving us in the 1700s, right? They're giving us this fractal, quantum, interconnected, much more classically yin or feminine kind of a reality. So I think there's a strangeness to the world. There's a strangeness to the historical moment. I think these are novel, and that metamodernism, in a way, is the tendency to simultaneously complete postmodernity and face the novelty of this moment. When it comes to the definition of metamodernism as an oscillation between the postmodern and the modern, I don't like that. I think it's a clumsy approximation. I think it leaves out, of course, the pre-modern, which is just as important, and it doesn't get the fact that that oscillation is an interior move that you do with any opponent processing. So Germain Marvel from Black Metamodernism, he uses this phrase diunital, both and thinking, the ability to go back and forth between interpretive options. And I think that's a spirit, it's a mood, it's a sensibility. And when we say it's an oscillation between modern and postmodern, it's true in the sense that a metamodernist can do that move really well. But the thing is, that move itself, which the metamodernist can do in all kinds of areas, you can do it between the masculine and the feminine. You can do it between the modern and the pre-modern. You can do it between top down and bottom up. You can do it between the imaginal and the gross realm. Right? It's the ability to do that move and the culture that emerges from that move. And that culture is the culture that completes the postmodern and also has the best chance of facing the peculiar things of this world historical moment.
So then where are all the women, Layman? This is what the real question is here, I think.
Okay, let's go back to that, Andrew. Where are the women? Exactly.
Yeah,
what
well, it's an interesting question.
No, what is a woman? Like, let's start with that before we ask where they are.
Yeah.
Two circles and a triangle.
No, you have to define your terms, you know?
Sure. But first you have to define the level of reality you're using to define your terms.
Well, I'm not
like when you look at woman is a socially amplified version of a physical gender that exists within our species, right? So it's our species physical gender plus a social thing, but that's not straightforward. There's a lot of different social ways to be what we call a woman, and there's a lot of different levels of the physical body at which the gender comes into play, right? So there's chromosomal gender, and there's hormonal gender, and there's anatomical gender. There's all these different levels. Like one of the famous things is if women give birth to sons, some of the DNA goes into her body and into her brain. So she's more of a man now because she had a son. And that kind of interchange is occurring at all of these levels. It's really useful for us to be able to simplify that, right? It's not dumb for nature and society to try to sort people into two rough categories, as long as we're not too draconian about it. But what are we trying to highlight with those two categories? What are the ways in which human beings can embody what we might call the eternal feminine or the eternal masculine, although eternal is probably a misleading term. What are the underlying architectures, the fundamental archetypes, and how abstract do we have to get in order to figure out what those are? Because if you look for these definitions in really the great, deep, strange religious traditions of the world, it's actually very peculiar. Like maybe we're talking about, on the one hand, form becoming formless as the nature of the feminine that informs the nature of woman. And maybe we're talking about formlessness becoming form when we're talking about the masculine, which informs the nature of the man. So I think that's one of the good languages that we have now. It's very classic to do things like, like a masculine is the dot, and then the feminine is the circle around the dot. And there's these very beautiful geometric simplifications that come down through occult and religious history. They're very useful, but I think one of the things we want to do today is capture the transformative aspect of it more. Right. So in the same way that we're moving largely from algebra to computation, where the difference is that computation is an unfolding transformative process and algebra is a fixed equation, that our definitions now need to capture the transformation itself. That's why I like to go to something like formlessness becoming form and form becoming formless. It doesn't have to be that particular phrasing, but I think if we're looking for the essence of male and female, masculine and feminine, we want to be able to articulate it as a reciprocal transformational process and not as fixed blocks of identity.
Okay, you say essence.
In
but
Dzogchen, you would call it luminosity and
wait
emptiness
a
and
second.
luminosity. Sorry.
A postmodernist would say there is no essence.
Well, there's several ways to handle that, right? So one of the things is you're going to build a metaphysics out of something that consists of the not essence-ness of things. Like, what is the essence of there not being an essence? And then once you have that grasp on that, you go, well, what are the types of ways in which there's no essence? You know, I'm going to call not having essence this way feminine, and I'm going to call not having essence this way masculine, something like that, right?
There's
So
essentially no essence, right?
That's right. And you can have essentially no essence in this way, and you can have essentially no essence this way. And it's really interesting things that happen when those interact with each other. But the other thing I want to come back to is this voluntary aspect of it, right? When we're talking about essence, we're not necessarily talking about something that's fixed from the very beginning. We might be talking about something that's produced as we go forward, more like a telos than an origin,
Yeah,
right?
good.
So that biology on the earth did not start out with sex. It's something that life invented after a while, right? It's something that you can volunteer to participate in the creation of, rather than something that was given to you from behind. And that goes some way to satisfy the postmodern critique, because we are co-creatively instantiating it, but that doesn't mean it has no value or utility.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the masculine as in the kind of in the classical Kabbalistic terms is, you know, there's this luminosity that is just exploding outward from the masculine, and then in the feminine is this great container, or this great womb, and then what contains the container, and that's the ultimate mystery, which is, you know, Keter, Chokpa, Bina in the Kabbalistic tradition. And I think those, and also in Dzogchen, it's always luminosity and emptiness, and essence, luminosity and emptiness. And so what, you know, where does, you know, first there's the nothingness state, and then luminosity emerges from the nothingness state, and then becomes something, like comes an appearance, right? They call that the three samadhis in Buddhism. First there's no thing, and then there's luminosity, and then something is concrete, something appears, you know. And this great mystery is, if there's no thing, but yet something appears. And, you know, you can use metaphor, sexual, you know, gender metaphors for that as well. It's just expansion, contraction, you know, form and emptiness.
I think there's something about, if we conceive of non-duality as like a general homogeneous quality that already subtracts all dualities, then
Right.
we have something that isn't very valuable. But if we think
Right.
of non-duality as something which shows up before, between, and as the result of dualities, then we have a very rich, powerful form of non-duality. And so if we ask ourselves a question like, what do emptiness and fullness or luminosity have in common? Then we have a really interesting question. And in the asking of that question, we have the ability to clarify the essence of non-duality and creativity in a new way that we wouldn't have had if we didn't ask ourselves the question through that complementarity.
Yeah.
Like, what is it that being in touch with everything and being free from everything have in common? Right? That's a kind of a pointing out instruction to achieve a certain form of non-duality, but it's only available to you when you start to think about these complementary profound opposites.
Yeah, and it's a non-duality that is strangely expressive and creative. So that's when we move into the tantric realm, and we're not just in the realm of emptiness, which is kind of the last pitfall.
I don't want to be like a. I don't want to be. like a postmodernist right now. But there was like this funny meme in the integral bed cave of yours, right?
Yeah.
And it's like it was. I don't get the gist of it. Was that, you know, one of the pitfalls of integral theory is not really engaging with the theories it tries to embody or tries to integrate. And because there's a point to that, because it's like you can't do both. You can't integrate everything and at the same time look from their perspective, right? You can't that's why it's so weird that you have like integral theory describing postmodernism in 3 words and basically in 3 sentences in every Wilber book. That doesn't account for postmodernism. It doesn't, right? And so because there's an argument to be made from the postmodernist view that there is no such thing as essence, right? When you say that's an essentialist thing, no, these are different strata of cognition, let's say, and of language patterns. And so I'm just, because you said, okay, there's an essence to non-duality. Is there?
Essence is a convenient way of speaking. I don't think we want to overly reify it, right? So here's what I think is one of the most beautiful things about postmodern wisdom is its fundamental skepticism. And that fundamental skepticism has to be allowed to flourish a little bit more than most people allow it to flourish. So I think the idea that there are no essences still assumes too much, right? If we want to really say what's metamodernism or postmodernism or integral theory, it's got to be more postmodern than the postmodern. It's going to say, yes, you don't know if there's essences, but you actually don't know. You're not in a position to say there are no essences. That's too dogmatic, right? To say that everything is relative is an absolute claim. You're not, if everything's relative, you couldn't even make that claim. You don't know, right? And then you come to a more spiritual and existential position. So I think what we need to deal with is like a super postmodernism in a way that doesn't even know whether or not there is enough essence to say whether there is essence or not.
But that was covered, right?
Yeah.
That's covered by Nargajuana, and that's covered by Neti, and that's covered by complete, the ultimate deconstructionists is covered in perennial Eastern philosophy. I think it just
this is not
anything that you think that you can
historical record.
Yeah, anything you think that you can make as an essence, is wrong.
But there's an important theme that comes out of postmodernism. Like we could say, yes, if you take postmodernism far enough, it starts to become this other thing. And that thing has something in common with the great ages and great insights of history and prehistory, which is the greatest period of time. But there's also a much more basic set of concerns that the postmodernist is trying to bring in. It's not really an abstract thought system. We're really trying to say, hey, the body, hey, nature, hey, other groups, hey, diversity, hey, everybody who's left out of the economic system, hey, look at the accumulating negative results of modernity. There are these very practical elements to the postmodern critique. And those elements in general could be classified as part of what I would call the yin cluster, right? We wouldn't have to use that metaphor necessarily, but a lot of those things take the feminine role relative to the modern position, relative to the position of modernity itself.
So the phallic role is constructivist, right? And then the postmodern role is always deconstructing everything.
There's a limited or degenerate form of modern masculinity that has to deal with its femininity in order to get to this next phase. And I think that's where this sort of lockdown between the modern and the postmodern has occurred. They're in a stalemate because they can't get the relationship between these complementary opposites correct. If they could, then they could produce the new thing, which would be this next level to inhabit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. It's like I'm thinking, I mean, I'm just playing Advocatus Diaboli.
Please.
But you know what? Again, it's like what I find so interesting is that it's not about the oppression per se, which is like the one of the issues or topics of postmodernism. It's that, that we as, Westerners start to understand how we create our life worlds through language and cognition, right? And so that doesn't really mean that there is no biological strata or physical strata. It just means the only way we can access it is through cognition and language, right? And so we always have to kind of process this when we are talking about things, that we are talking about, well, about our own processes, our own cognitions, our own expectations, our own model of the world. It's not, it's like, is there a masculine thing per se? Is there a feminine thing per se? Right?
Right. So it's not about these, it's not, right. If we're thinking of healthy postmodernism, it's not a set of new conclusions. It's a way of being that's introduces an extra realm of health, like you're saying, health around our linguistic and symbolic co-creation of our experience of reality. Right. So that's one of the things that I would be doing in this course. And one of the things I think that any meta-modern or new approach to folding in the dualities within the regeneration of spirituality has to do. We can't just have, I mean, yes, the perennial tradition does include fully deconstructed brilliant sages, but the perennial tradition also includes a lot of colloquial speech that we have to be able to get beyond. Right, we have to have that meta and deconstructive conversation. If we're going to do a meta modern spirituality, everybody has to say, here's how I see it, and maybe this is why, and I'm not sure, and it could be like this, but it maybe could be like this, and I understand that I'm bound by the limitations of these words. And right, like, why is there duality? Possibly it's because I have a lazy human brain that likes dualities, or partly because it's a cultural construct. All of these things are in play, and we don't know to what degree they're in play. So if we want to show up and co-create a more authentic contemporary culture, we have to be kind of capable of being transparent about that with each other. And I think that's one of the healthy versions of postmodernity. It's unhealthy when it locks it down, but it's really healthy when it says, let's have that conversation so that we can show up together more richly.
Right. And so let me just add one thing. So because I also think that there is an element that goes beyond postmodernism, is when you are kind of aware which notions, which cognitions you want to reify by having them. Right? You know what I'm saying? So you have to choose what kind of world you want to create. Like, what does these concepts that I'm choosing now to embody, to live, do with me, with my social world, do in 1 year, 5 years? Are these concepts that are, functional? But it is like, because there's an awareness that should go with it, that everything that I think, that everything that I say will reify, will permeate in, like go into the future, and will create its own karma. Let's use a spiritual word. And so that is something that postmodernism doesn't concern itself with, right? So the constructive, positivist aspect of it. But I think, there is a point that, that we have to be very aware and cautiously aware about what we describe and how we describe it, because tomorrow we will be confined by these very descriptions.
Now, depends at the scale we're looking at it, right? So if we just zoomed in on that part and go, there's a certain responsibility inherent in our descriptions, in our inner cognitive descriptions, and in our verbal exchanges. They're not neutral. They create realities, they create habits, they determine futures. And so we are intentional participants in that. But ignoring that is a problem. Right. Getting too anxious and involved in that is a problem. So you come back to this basic dance move that's got to be maintained within any of these areas. Because the person who's neurotically obsessed with the fact that everything they do is going to set up a future loses their ability to act.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so that
the other
leaves,
thing,
like,
of course, we have to remember is that,
Well, so where are the women then?
First of all, some of them are around, right? We had a very good cohort of women in the last course that I
Right.
ran.
That's
We're
true.
hoping for this again. And I think that's one of the reasons we're doing this. Like, obviously, transcendental dualism is a nice next step after looking at non duality in the network culture.
Yeah.
But I think it was the interaction between men and women in the course that largely inspired the idea that this should focus more on that. So they are in play. Also, they're doing other things, right? It's not always as interesting to the women to be the person on camera espousing their ideas. Sometimes people say, "Where are the women?" And I say, "She's upstairs making dinner," right? It's not like she's not here, but she doesn't think of herself as having to be the person on the magic chair.
Right.
We
You're
can
such a
have a
chauvinist,
conversation later.
Layman. I never knew that
I
you were
know,
such
right?
a chauvinist. It's just terrible. I'm shocked and appalled. You're
I
making your
want there to
woman
be more
cook
women
while
in
you're
this
here
space.
talking to us.
That's right. Now, then when I cook, am I the woman?
Yeah, that's
Yes and
another.
no.
You're being very essentialist there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we want to be able to do, is to play in the essences without getting trapped by any of them.
Yeah.
Right? We want to create a space in which, like, we don't know. Nobody is the perfect knower of all the essences, and nobody is the perfect knower of the fact that there's no essences. So we take that perfect knower out of the equation, and we have to play with each other some way. And some of those will be more successful, some will be less successful. Some people will be more inclined to play one particular role. Other people, more shamanic in the bard sense, will be much more fluid about how they play with those things.
Yeah.
Well, that's
But we
great.
do have to, yeah.
No, that was my initial, that was what I wanted to ask you, like phrasing my question when we started this conversation. That is the long and that was the long and winding road to the answer, I guess.
Yeah. I mean,
I
everybody
would
is
also
so
add this one more thing,
unbelievably
which I
unique,
added in
right?
my Substack recently. Like, when I put the Where Are the Women in the Substack, one thing I want to add is, as we try to articulate the archetype of the feminine, which is ambiguous in its relationship to what a woman is, but there is this sense in which the question, "Where are the women?" or the question, "What about the women?" is a way of articulating the essence of the feminine, right? That the one thing we do with the masculine is pretend that it's simple and obvious. And one thing we do with the feminine is pretend that it's kind of nebulous and open-ended and escapes from our definitions. We don't ask, "Where is the masculine?" We assume the masculine is asking the question. And we ask, "Where is the feminine?" because the openness and the uncertainty and the mystery, right? Like the feminine is the stripper who escapes from the clothes. We're not sure, where is she gone? And the masculine is sort of the building of these encasements, the formlessness becoming the form.
Yeah.
I don't think
I
so.
was running up. Go ahead, Tom.
Sorry, Andrew, but I half jokingly, I was about to say, I mean, if feminism is true, right? And society needs more feminism, which I absolutely subscribe to. So we should the woman should put their money where their mouth is, you know. So let's put them on the chair, you know. So why are we so gentle and so like, oh no, like they're mysterious? No, if they want to partake in, you know, what Camille Paglia would say, the outer realm of the tribe, you know, that kind of thing that historically speaking was more like the thing of men, then they should do it, and then we shouldn't excuse their behavior not to do it. I mean, I'm half joking. Yeah.
No, there's right. What we're not going to do, I think, in a meta modern use of these things, is to make some arbitrary ruler that splits the population into two groups, so then you have to stay in your group. Right? It's nothing like that. This is a kind of voluntary role playing, and it has to have the organic, complex intelligence to negotiate itself. We are going to find that men and women are going to go into masculine and feminine modes. We're going to find that people want to stay on the line, or people want to switch sides. Now, there's a good chance that that's not going to be most of the people who are trying to occupy these roles, but there's no need to overimpose any boundary. right? We absolutely want women to take that chair, but we don't want to impose the idea that they're the ones who aren't seen on the camera, nor do we want to impose the idea that they need to show up on the camera and that
Because
they're
then we're
not doing it
mansplaining,
fully.
right?
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
then we're doing more mansplaining. Like, I mean, I was thinking about this term, right? Because people were kind of making fun of it, but there's something true about that quality of men, right? That they have to explain everything, and they have to put it in a theory and a concept and concretize everything, and the neurotic masculinity, right, is really this reification of categories and this and that, and so that gets kind of stuck.
Mhm.
And I think
There is that tendency in the masculine for sure,
and that's
although
definitely
it's also a
that's
very
definitely
general tendency.
in our circles, because we have intellectual men, a lot of really mental intellectual men, which is kind of, it's interesting because I was running a men's group with a bunch of intellectual. The first men's group I was in was kind of ordinary dudes. Like, there was something more ordinary about the kind of people that were in the first group I was in, and that kind of worked. But then when you got a bunch of intellectual men together, in a way, all hell broke loose, because there's too much reification, there's too much conceptuality, and I felt like there needed to be women, or there needs to be women. So that was my big, there needs to be women to break that reified conceptual prison that men always create, and especially in metamodernism, it seems to me.
I think
if I can be a little bit critical
the
here.
other is, to take this to an abstract level, the remembrance of the other is essential, right? So that, yes, there need to be women, or also the body, or also the environment, or also the person you're talking to, right? Because you can get a lot of women do a thing that is the exact same as mansplaining, which is they espouse an instruction that you already know from their own narcissistic point of view in a way that feels extremely insulting, right? This happens all the time, right? And the problem there is the same problem. It's forgetting that you're communicating to an other, and that other could be the body, could be nature, could be woman, could be whatever it is. That takes the yin position in this sort of abstract spiritual dialectics. But unless both of the complementarities are in play, then you get a problematic situation.
And this is the sort of schizophrenic nature.
To have women show up in every situation where men are occupied, right? Women don't have to fully be participants in every men's retreat or something like that, or vice versa. But there is a degree of remembering the relationship to the other that's necessary to ground whatever we're doing.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, but I'm still hung up on the imposing thing, because it's not about imposing, right? It's about consistency. You said we men, we shouldn't impose onto women, like to act as we men or whatever. But there's this joke from Bill Burr, he says that you have like the feminist, and with their short hair, and then as soon as the house is burning, they curl the little hairs to little, ponytails, like, please let me get out first. And this is like, he points to an inconsistency, because they want to have it both ways. They want to, and so it's like, no, it's not about imposing that they do that. If it's more like, okay, you want to do it, you want to subscribe to feminism, then don't cherry pick what you do. Just commit to it. Show yourself. Go and speak and make podcasts, whatever. Because there is still, after, I have this publishing house. It's the same experience there. I started with Lateral Conversations, the same experience there. Now with Parallax, it's like, I invite always women, right? And I would always invite men. Men tend to say yes to the podcast. Women,
that's true, isn't it?
Tend to say no. They tend to,
or they hesitate a lot more. I was just trying to get 2 women on my podcast too, and it took like 10 emails to get them to come. It's very interesting. Hesitation.
There's a lot more.
Because there's something about the feminine that needs to test out the situation.
And so just let me finish that, because we were talking about the reification of the concepts that we're having. And when we what's the pronunciation of that word? If we choose to have these concepts, then they will reiterate and iterate into the future. You know, it's like, oh no, it's like, that's not my space. Yeah, but it should be, right? Like.
So I think there's two things I'm hearing very strongly in that. One is how development always works, right? So as development occurs, what you want to do is discover the relationship between different aspects of yourself. You're like, oh, I've been doing this, but I've also been doing this. If I allow those to communicate with each other and look for more consistency between them, what new creative evolution does that force forth from me, right? So women, men, everybody have got to be involved in a developmental practice where they're open to seeing contradictions between different aspects of their behavioral profile and willing to undergo the Gurdjieffian friction between those so that they can get into a more consistent, more harmonized relationship with each other. But the other side of it is also that we have to be able to experientially do both of the moves that we associate with yin yang, or masculine feminine, right? So it is completely legitimate to say to a bunch of men in a podcasting space, is there something you can do to make this a more inviting space for women? That's reasonable. But it's equally reasonable to say to the women, is there something you can do to not need as much invitation, to just come forward and present? Because the men also don't know what they're talking about. The men also are in ambiguity, right? And they're coming forward. If you want to play that game, you actually can just come forward much more than you think you can. That's true. But it's also true that invitation needs to be a more nuanced art in these spaces.
Right.
I think there's a beauty to the resonance.
We need to be able to play both of these sides in ourselves. And right, these are modes. And the more we understand both the modes, the better our chances of success in any enterprise.
Yeah. But I was going to say that I think it's kind of there's a beauty in the way that a woman has to test the situation. You know, and has much more sensitivity to the wild kind of energies. And it's like, okay, should I go there? There's something wise in that, right? And there's something reckless about men. So I think that men like to be reckless and do dangerous things. I think there's women can have a different style of really or whatever, but I think I understand why women don't really want to come and hang out with a bunch of really intellectual guys in a podcast. It just wouldn't be a space for a lot of women to feel comfortable. Not that there aren't unusual women who are very who love that kind of shit. Like, we know, Raven and Bonita and people like that, seem to have an ability to swim in and out of all kinds of, different spaces. But I think there is I don't know. I don't want to throw away essence so much. I resist the idea of just saying there's no essence, because I think there is an intelligence in nature and biology that is real. So anyway, maybe I'm misunderstanding Tom, but
no, I'm just
no. But
I mean, I would say you have to be able to do both of those moves, right? That's what's the masculine and feminine within that thing you're just discussing, Andrew, right? Like, we have to be able to assert essences, and we have to be able to escape from essences. And if we can do both of those, then that dance becomes something that we can make use of. If we get trapped in either of those, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like the perfect utopia. It's like, still, I think Star Trek holds up. The good Star Trek, not that of the last couple of years, but the idea that, okay, there's a uniformity there, but this uniformity allows people to express themselves fully. It's a nice thing, because it's like we're talking about limitations and freedoms, and so these are fully embodied women that are depicted in the Star Trek universe, and they have like the same abilities and possibilities as men, and that's why it's an utopia, because it's not like this. The problem that I have is that when feminism, or when all this gets weaponized, it's like, okay, because I heard this a couple of times, why don't you invite more women? I did. They're not coming. And it's just like, what? That's the problem. It's like, it's easy if you weaponize it. It's easy to claim that it's the man's fault that women are not more populating, let's say, the podcast space. But the reality is, it's, you know, and sometimes maybe it is. I don't know all of them, but I can imagine that there are like misogynists not wanting women on their podcast. But on the other side, it's like they're not really doing their best to show up, you know, because it's like if you turn it around and say, oh, men want to be more feminine and let's help more with education and child rearing, and women take them to task. If a man does something shitty in the household, holding a baby, you know, he gets it from the woman, because she knows how to take him to task, you know, because it's important, you know, that the man completely changes and learns to occupy the other space. I just feel that we men don't do that enough for women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, you get what I'm saying?
The masculine to feminine challenge is not well understood going forward, right? Historically, we have versions of that, which have had good elements and bad elements, right? And then we've had a period of time culturally where we've felt the men have been not really encouraged to present a challenge to the feminine. But both parties need to be able to challenge the other. So what does the masculine challenge to the feminine look like in a meta-modern future? And similar to the brain thing, right?
Well,
if you're looking at that Ian McGilchrist model, when is the left brain legitimately supposed to say no to the right brain? Right? This is a really unexplored question, and no one of us can say what the answer is, because we've got to convene collaborative spaces where we have the difficult conversations of trying to start to figure that out.
Well, yeah, my answer, like what is the challenge? The masculine thing is to say is no. It's like no to seduction. That's so beautiful in a masculine sense. Just as the feminine is so beautiful in its seductive voluptuousness, right? The masculine no is absolutely the most elegant thing there is.
There's a no to seduction. Another important one is a no to additional considerations, right?
That's good too. That's great too.
Right. I had a friend, probably the woman who taught me the most about how to be friends with a woman, and she would always feel like her space was too cluttered, and she would ask me to come over, and she would get a bottle of wine. She'd say, listen, just sit there, because I can't throw things out. It's too complicated. I see too many parts of it. And what I would love for you to do is just give me a yes or no on each thing. And I could be like, no, throw that away, throw that away, throw that away. Because this is the feedback from the point of view that's not taking all of those things into consideration. That kind of masculine move that's going to go, basically I could just chuck this out right now. I don't actually have to touch and attend to all of those other ecological considerations. Now, that has problems of its own, but it's a legitimate piece of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's necessary as a sort of, because the feminine on its own is ultimately is a fire that just continues to burn without that cooling energy of the masculine, you know. So
I talk a lot about,
and I think people don't like that because it sounds a little bit too cliche or something. But go ahead. Sorry.
What I was sort of riffing off that was sort of, there's nature and there's the natural, right? We could parse these semantically any way we want, but there's a sense in which nature is all of these things and it would kill you and everyone you care about. And then there's natural, which is lovely and restorative and works really well with human beings, right? So what we don't want is just nature. We don't want the goddess in her raw form. The goddess in her raw form will kill everyone and not care anything about it. What we need is the goddess challenged forth to be a better version of herself, just like we need the masculine and the human challenged forth to be a better version of itself. Collaboratively, these two can become something much more impressive than either of them on their own, because either of them on their own are basically nihilistic maelstroms, you know?
Yeah. And it's not just a collaboration, it's a fight too, you know? I mean, and that's good. I mean, I'm not promoting you know, conflict or anything like that, but there's a beautiful fight between those between nature and its expressive, again, I like the word voluptuous or whatever, and then this like cutting through of not being fooled by the entire show, right?
There's something difficult in it, right? We have to
Yeah,
be able to embrace the kernel
yeah.
of the friction. Earlier, Andrew, you said, why is it that people are finding the phraseology of masculine and feminine, the idea of essence, is problematic, right? And there's like a meta question is, well, shouldn't it be problematic? Shouldn't we feel
Okay.
like there's a problematic core in that, that's the very thing we're going to work with if we want to go into that territory?
But it's often a denial. It's not that kind of problem, like positive, friction, which creates sparks. It's almost like, no, I don't want to look at that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm
Well, that's
reacting
right. But
against.
that's our job, right? Our job is to take that over and give it a new significance, right? We want to say to the postmodern, yes, you guys have detected many interesting things, including all these skepticisms, including these linguistic constructions, including this problematic dimension. You are correct. There is a problematic element to it. But we are now going to say to you, it has a different significance than you've thought. There's a depth to this. There's a transformative possibility. You've just been looking at the fact of its problematicity. We're saying this could be transfigured. There's an alchemical process by which we work with this problematic dimension to give ourselves a greater richness of reality.
That's so interesting because, the reaction of, let's say, the American, Republicans, the conservatives against postmodernism and woke and so that's not a real masculine response, if we follow that argumentation, because the real challenge and the real masculine response would be, okay, no, now do it. Don't complain, just do it. There's a difference.
It's not being involved, getting involved in the drama. See, the Republican thing is to create another big drama about the drama, right? So you're still in the same vicious circle of woke and anti-woke, right? But the masculine is like stepping outside of that, and
I think our friend Alexander Bard would say that that's a very feminine move on the part of the quasi-conservatives that we see around the world.
Right.
That there's something that the female brain or the feminine essence is more disposed toward the mimetic and the dramatic as a mode of communication.
And towards family and towards order and towards, towards keeping things clean and towards, making sure that everything is okay. And,
I mean, you can't go back
once we start.
You go.
Once we start applying the lens, we're like, okay, we're going to use masculine and feminine or yin yang. We have to zero in very carefully because there's a lot of tangles everywhere, right? There are ways in which we might say liberals are feminine and Republicans are masculine. Yeah. There's ways in which we might say the exact opposite.
The opposite.
And those don't cancel each other out. It turns out we're actually looking at slightly different aspects. And when we realize the context of what we're zeroing in on, we can get a lot more consistency in our use of these terminologies.
Yeah. And also, I think there's a way in which we like to really have these strong definitions of the masculine. It's like the sort of, like in the men's groups, there's a cringeworthy aspect to them. And that is just kind of like beating your chest and kind of like having a beard and all that sort of stuff doesn't really capture the masculinity. It's a caricature. And I think we tend to have these caricatures. Same goes with femininity as well, but
I mean, it's showing
that's one of the real questions will be what's authentic in all of this, right? Like, what's the authentic feminine versus the cartoon of the feminine? What's the authentic masculine versus the cartoon of the masculine?
But it can't be defined. It can't be put in any. It can't be defined through language and words and concepts.
No, it can't be defined, but it can be explored, right? So that's what we want to do in the course is individually go through practices where we move back and forth between these aspects, and collectively work out the living spirit that's always redefining these things amongst each other, and figure out if we can do that in a way that contributes to the production of the sacred in a meta-modern cultural and cognitive space.
So, okay, let's wrap it up, boys. The course starts April the 2nd, right?
April 2nd. It's every Sunday in April. It's like going to church.
Right. Perfect.
Wonderful. I feel like I could talk for another hour about this stuff. It's really a passionate
It is, and I think
subject.
that's
And
one of the interesting things. And one of the reasons why we haven't seen, some people focus on this very strongly, but in the general community, there's a bit of a reluctance because
people
there's
avoid it.
so much intrigue and there's so much energy here, right? So I think we need to start taking the risk of opening up these topics, and it's going to be messy, but that's okay. That's how we figure out our way through this stuff.
Yeah, and people are traumatized by their own sexuality in a way, and don't know how to use it and where to put it and what it means, and so we don't talk about it. We keep it secret. At the same time, there's just porn it's like there's an ultimate puritanism happening at the same time as there's an ultimate kind of pseudo hedonism happening, but then getting to the real business is very interesting.